Every day, you essentially pay your dues by doing the harder thing when it's the right thing to do.
All right, everybody, welcome back. This is our third rendition of this podcast now. We've been booted off 3 times off the internet now, so we're trying Dave's platform. But Dave, thanks for being a kind soul and volunteering your own podcast platform for us to use.
I'm happy to do it, man. What's up?
Not much. So for today, we want to talk all about gymnastics. Dave is a gymnastics rehab aficionado, I guess we could say. And as I was saying before, is gymnastics for me is such a fun sport to rehab. These athletes are absolute monsters. They have incredible strength, mobility, just physical abilities in so many different aspects of fitness. But it can also be very hard because there is so much on these athletes of their training. Sometimes even like 12 to 16-year-old girls I've seen training 4 hours a day after school,
Sure.
5-6 days a week sometimes, and it comes this whole different way we have to kind of medically manage these types of individuals. So as we were talking about, what percent is overtraining and why is that?
Yeah, I think not in a malicious way, like they're not trying to abuse kids, but I think like because of a variety of things, the culture still progressing, or maybe a lack of science-based methods being taught to coaches when there's no real like onboarding formally for coaching education. That's a big problem of it. But then also too, just like a lack of interdisciplinary care for, a lot of these clubs. It's hard to find a group of people like you have at a college level, but I'd say I would probably put it in the 50%, and I mean that by not just straight volume of training, but their goals. They want to make it to level 8, level 9, level 10, college, elite. They want to make national team and go to a world or Olympic championship. And they don't realize that that's like an age could be like 20, 25, 30, they could be 20 to 30 years old and reach those goals. The misconception and the myth that we're still working through is that all has to happen before the age of 18. That's like your peak, quote unquote, which is not supported by any research, but also we've seen multiple examples of people who are 24, 26, 28. Ellie Black, for example, is in her like upper 20s, Danusha Francis, all those people, the Downey twins, Simone Biles, they're all older, and so if we know now that it's possible, not only is it possible, but you're also probably going to be better off later in your career reaching those goals. I think the overtraining comes where the pace at 8, 10, 12 years old does not reflect a 10, 15 year career. It's just like, we have to go right now. We're going to miss our shot. There's a lot of like fear of missing out and like getting to this X, like, and they keep like putting kids on like a hamster wheel of next thing, next thing, next thing, next thing. So I'm friends with some people who do work with these athletes who eventually get to national and Olympic level goals. And they will tell you that you can train, hard and set the foundations up when you're young, but you have a tidal wave, which is puberty coming, at 12, 14, 16 years old. And you're going to get rocked if you don't prepare appropriately.
Yeah, and so of all those athletes you mentioned, do we know if those girls were training 6 days a week for 4 hours a day, or were they training less than that?
Yeah, I think, I talked to Amy Borman, who is Simone's coach, and she didn't do, any like crazy quote unquote volume of training until she actually made the national team and was competing for her first Olympic quad. But she said Simone would train 5 days per week for 4 hours and she had weekends off, so maybe she would do some extra prehab stuff and things on the side. But, she's clearly a genetic freak, right? She's like the GOAT in terms of like what can happen athletically. But I know a lot of coaches who train 20 to 25 hours per week and get extremely high level results. But within those 20 to 25 hours, there's a lot of dynamic warm up, flexibility, prehab, strength and conditioning. Like there's a lot of extra stuff caked in there. That's not just volume of skills. And so that's the tough thing too with, I'm a proponent of maybe giving consensus statements around guidelines about like how much should a 12-year-old level 8 train or how much should a 12-year-old level 10 train or something like that. But I think it's really hard because within a gym, I've seen some gyms that have 20 hours on paper and it's like craftsmanship. It's super well planned out. They have workload, periodization. They really monitor the kids well. There are a lot of communication and feedback around skill acquisition. It's great. And then I've seen other gyms that are 15 hours per week and they just murder the kids. It's just like nonstop reps and pounding and go. And there's no thought process for the methodology of like how long it goes or the methodology. So yeah, I think it's tricky there, but I would say that it's definitely doable in 20 hours a week. And I think that we need to be much better about curbing the volume and intensity of what they're doing, particularly in like the 10 to 14 year range, is really where I see the majority of problems really start to snowball, because you're young and you can handle training volume, but then of course, it catches up with you later, and you can bounce back when you're young and growing, but there's so much important stuff that developmentally wise we have to have there. So I think if we can push the ages out longer and encourage people to specialize later and train in that 8 to 14 window and be very methodical about that, get them through puberty, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, you can do anything you want, and then if you want to go elite or college, you have the runways open past there.
And so do you think gymnastics, especially in that pubescent stage and adolescent stage, should they be training gymnastics year round, or should they be focusing on being a multi-sport athlete?
Yeah, I would say that, the research and the consensus statements in the IOC would say that you don't want to specialize before the age of like 15, right? That's like what a lot of people say for like baseball, basketball, whatever. So I think that gymnastics skews younger and you will have to specialize earlier, but I think at least 10. I really believe that at least till 10 years old, you should do a variety of sports. You should go on family vacations. You should be a kid. You should, just grow and develop, because there's obviously the mental health aspect of that, which is risking burnout, right? And there's also overuse injury with repetitive patterns of jumping and landing or whatever. But then there's also, is from a performance point of view, whether you're looking at Esteban Balle's research or many of the people, we know that the more generally athletic we can start somebody off in their career, they can have a higher peak ceiling down the road. So I think that the fear and the misconception in gymnastics is that if we don't specialize early enough, we're going to miss out on our window of getting on that early train to success. And I think in reality, what we're doing actually is we're probably pigeonholing kids into a limited long-term athletic performance. You know what I mean? So I think that, we did a study in college gymnastics looking at Achilles tears and stuff, and we found that the average age of specialization was like 7 to 8. And most kids were under that at 6, right? So like a lot of kids were around the 6 years old, were only doing gymnastics. And I would make the argument that if you have a great coaching staff from a young age who understands someone's really talented and the long-term goal is a college scholarship at 18 or a world championship team at whatever, or just they want to do gymnastics and have fun, they understand that by diversifying their athletic profile when they're younger, they can have a better chance long-term. And so there's actually, I'm sorry to ramble, but there's a girl that I'm working with now. She unfortunately tore her ACL. She's 16, but she was one of the most successful young gymnasts I've ever seen. She was a level 10 competitive gymnast. She played lacrosse varsity. She played soccer varsity, or another sport, field hockey maybe. And she was a monster at all of them, right? And like, of course, now she has an ACL tear that she got from gymnastics, but hard to know if that was correlative or causation. But like up until 16, man, she was torching everybody like really, really well. And I think that plus the year-round training conversation could really pull out, maybe like, we can take the best of what we do traditionally and then maybe add in some cross training up until, 10 to years old, and like do a bunch of different sports. Maybe 10 to 12, we start lifting, and around 12, we get them through puberty to 14. Then 14, if you want to specialize, or from 10 to 12, you want to just focus on gymnastics and cross train, we could probably get away with that if you have really high level goals. I think that model is what I would like to see entertained, because we have no comparison right now. The only thing we have is blistering pace, really young, go hard. And if somebody gets hurt, it's like, oh, it's a bummer.
Yeah, I see it's hard. And I've heard these conversations with parents too, is like, well, her friends are all doing, signing up for more camps and this and that. And like, she wants to do soccer, but she's going to fall behind on gymnastics. So we're going to put her in. It's like, is that necessarily true that that's going to happen, or is some rest going to get them more of a longevity state of doing this longer and not being mentally burnt out? Because I've had plenty of conversations with parents too, it seems like there's certain gyms that do this, but it's like, my daughter's not sleeping. She doesn't have an appetite. She hasn't hit puberty yet, and we think she should have. And it's like, okay, like, and we have a stress fracture. And it's like, okay, we have to take a step back and look at everything. And they want exercises from a PT. And it's like, well, we have to manage, all the volume she's doing, what she's actually doing in the gym. And it becomes very hard. So it's like, parents and coaches together, it seems like, have to come to some confirmation to get the sport going in the right direction as far as the health of the kids.
Yeah. And like, just from hearing so many people and working with so many people, when you said those things, which is delayed puberty, and you could even argue, and there's maybe this delayed menstrual cycle, stress fractures, overtraining, not sleeping, not eating enough, that screams red S to me. That just screams overtraining and nutritional issues, right? And like, that is still a massive elephant in the room within gymnastics that is getting better. But like, there is still a just brutal level of body image insecurity and issues and horrific nutritional advice giving out to some people. And it's not malicious. It's like mainstream magazines are giving advice for like 50-year-old women and men to intermittent fast and not eat carbs, right? Because they want to cycle. And like that's getting trickled down to some 12-year-old sees that on TikTok from her favorite influencer and thinks that, oh, I shouldn't eat carbs and I should intermittent fast because that's how I'll like be athletically performing. And it's like, okay, well, like we have a glycolytic sport and your brain runs on carbs. No wonder why you're struggling to train and adapt. So there's a lot more, thankfully now. And I 10 years ago or 5 years ago, I think I would have been a little bit less optimistic. But now there are a lot of really great people in the sport of gymnastics who are hustling to get really good information. So two friends of mine, Alicia and Chelsea, are the coordinators now. So they're great. They're doing a wonderful job. But Marcia and Ellen are the two physicians for Team USA. And they're monsters, man. They're amazing academically. We're research partners. They put out great information, but there's so many like great nutritionists, strength and conditioning coaches. Like, I think they're starting to really seep in, and I think it becomes a situation where a lot of coaches in gymnastics, I'm extremely empathetic to because I've been coaching for the last 15 years and I know how hard it is to work with 13 to 17-year-old girls every day, like who are going through puberty and gymnastics and parents and colleges and social media. Like, I get it, man. Like, it's for real out here, but like, it's really hard for a coach to have to juggle all those plates. And they're equally as exhausted with like, I'm doing all the things I was told to do that I think we're going to be successful. And I'm still running into a wall with injuries and overuse, and people are changing sports because they're burnt out or whatever, medically retiring. So they're equally as exhausted and want change as much as some of the parents and some of the, as medical providers we do. So you're seeing that open-minded acceptance of a lot of new research ideas and interdisciplinary care, and let's try something different, even if it makes us kind of like take a step and stumble a little bit for a couple months or years. We are seeing the culture move that way, and that's encouraging for sure.
Yeah, and it sounds almost like some of that could just be prevented by like having the kids take another day off during the week or have like some shorter practice sessions and things too, which is it's a tough way to move the field with the way everyone collaborates in it, I guess. But say you have someone in the state that is overtraining, they're stressed, they're not hitting puberty, they're not getting their menstrual cycle, athletic amenorrhea. Where do you, and say they have a stress fracture or any type of pain or injury, where do you start with someone like that?
Yeah, I have tried 39 ways to not approach these conversations well, and I've gotten chewed out by like national team coaches and other people because I take it from the point of like health, longevity, injuries, right? And like, when you're in a performance mindset, the higher you climb up the ladder of performance, like, come on, like some people don't give a shit about that, man. Like, they're just like, I want to train. I want to work hard. I want to make my goals. I have a scholarship to get. Like, I'm ready to go. And like, I don't have that competitive blood. So it's hard for me to empathize with that, but I understand where they're wanting to go. So the only thing that I've found is I've read a bunch of books and research on like what makes true meaningful change in people's lives and lifestyles and habits, and reverse engineering what they want out of the sport or what they want out of their goals is really, really important. So if someone, like, I have multiple times when someone's like back fracture, overexhausted, like training way too much, like shin splints are coming on preseason. And it's just like, take a step back and you're like, yo, what do you want with gymnastics? Like, what are your goals? And 9 times out of 10, it's like, I want to get a college scholarship. I want to move up in level. I want to compete this skill. I want to have fun with my friends and stay involved with my community. And you essentially just have to context specifically pull out what that most important goal is for them. So let's use like the scholarship, because that's really popular right now with a lot of gymnastics. It's like, I want to get a scholarship my junior year, right? So it's like, okay, you're 14, right? And if you want to get a scholarship and be 100% like you want to have all your skills and ready to roll, no college can even talk to you or entertain those ideas until junior year, right? Which means sophomore year, you need to kind of be ready to rumble getting your film. So you'll probably be 16 when that happens. You just turned 14 right now and you have a back fracture, your shin's hurt, you're training all the time, you're exhausted, your schoolwork's not going well. Like, do you think this is a sustainable roadmap to be peak performance in 2 years and then be peak performance in 2 more years to get that scholarship? And then, oh, by the way, you actually have to perform for 4 years more after that when you get to the school, because they are now giving you a scholarship to compete and train for your team. So when you open up the broader perspective of like, okay, your goals are college, which means in 2 years from now, you have to be fully healthy, fully ready to go. Do you think this is sustainable? And usually they're like, no, there's no way I can train this hard, this aggressively for 2 full more years and not break, not fall apart. Like, there's some athletes I've worked with that have cumulatively missed 2 to 2.5 years of training since the age of 10, because they've just like osgood slaughters, then a back thing, then a shoulder thing, then an elbow thing. And like, they're just constantly running uphill with their injuries. So you kind of have like an empathetic moment of like what they want. And then you reverse engineer that. You go, okay, well, listen, if we want to get you healthy, let's take a step back and realize that your back fracture comes from a couple things. One, workload. You did way too much too fast while you were still growing. And clearly you're back bending so much or extending so much, it's hurting you. Two, we probably have a lot of flexibility issues above and below we have to deal with, and or strength and conditioning things we have to deal with. So those three things got to be dealt with first. And beyond that, if you're not sleeping well, fueling yourself properly, and managing your stress, you have zero recovery. You have no parasympathetic shift. I don't use this language, but the allostatic overload theory is like, you're wear and tear the system because you don't have tissue adaptation, tissue recovery. There's no macronutrients to fuel that. So you just reverse engineer, like, what are the big low hanging fruit buckets that we need to knock off to make you reach your goals you told me you want? Workload management, flexibility, strength, sleep, fueling yourself properly. So let's just take those 5 things. I can help you with 3, and let's refer you out to these 2 because I'm not a nutritionist, right? So let's find the people who can help you. And then we kind of start the sync on that. Let's work on these things for your back. In a couple of weeks, let's touch base. Like, hey, have you thought about this? What do you want to start with? And some people are like, the whole nutrition bucket's very psychological. There's a lot of emotional attachment there. But like, I think it makes sense that I need to work on my flexibility a lot. So let's do that. So I'll give them a program for their shoulders and their hips. And then we establish rapport. We chat for another week or 2. It's like, okay, like, what else do you want to tackle? It's like, you know what? I see the college girls lift, and I know a lot of people are starting it. I'm just really intimidated by it. I don't know really quite where to start. I don't want to get bulky. I don't want to lose my flexibility. And I'm like, totally understand. But like, we got some great strength coaches over here that work with the elites and the college girls that you look up to. So let's have a consult with them, and you can lift 1 day per week as a prehab program or maintenance care program. We just make it a rehab program. It's like a hardcore rehab program with Duesh and Jonah. So now we got 2. And then finally down the road, it's like, okay, I want to talk to, my Christina or Carrie, these friends that I have that are great nutritionists that work with the elites. Let's get you a consult with them. You know what I mean? Like I'll connect you guys on email. And you just slowly over a 6-month rehab, try to get more and more on board. Some people literally never want to hear it. They don't want to hear it. They come in, I'm an elite. I got to make camp. I got to kill myself to get it. And the parents want to do it. The kid wants to do it. They're like robots. I'm like, all right, here's what I think. And okay, like you asked my opinion. You don't want to take it. So see you in a couple months, maybe. I hope you the best.
Yeah. And so I guess on the nutrition side, just the basics here, do we have an idea of, and it's definitely a range because everyone's metabolism is different and different body weight size, just base BMR. How many calories do you think these individuals are burning, per day, just in the gym? If they're doing like a 4-hour session.
Yeah, I defer to, so Christina Anderson's a friend of mine. And she's kind of talked about this in her programming. I think she said that the average like competitive gymnast optional is somewhere in like the 3,000 calorie range is a minimum. So like just to be alive is like, obviously depending on age, weight, all that kind of stuff. But I think she said it was somewhere like in the 1 to 1,500 is where just like don't die, and then you have like the extra 500 for like school, function, basal metabolic rate, recovery, stuff like that. And then you actually have a 4-hour practice that's pretty brutal, which you could argue is probably another 1,000 inside of there. And that's just like net zero, right? Not alone the positive, anabolic state of trying to grow tissue and you're going through puberty and repairing bone and cartilage. So yeah, I'll defer to her on the exact numbers, but my gut is telling me it's somewhere in the 3,000 range is like the barrier to entry to just train at a high level and, grow and get through those years. And that's what she says is the most problematic thing she says she sees with all of her clients is unintentional underfueling. They're not trying to diet. They're not trying to follow crazy advice. They're just doing what they think is food. They just eat throughout the day and they get busy with school and they don't have snacks packed and they just like try to grab food at lunch, then eat before practice. And they don't realize that they're in such a deficit.
That's crazy. And this would be for someone that could be like a 14 to 16-year-old female, and they could potentially be needing up to 3,500 calories a day, which I don't even eat that much as a 225-pound male. And that's hard work to do too. And that's the thing is I think in those conversations I've had with parents and the patient athlete as well is, do you think you're eating well? Yeah, I eat pretty good. And mom and dad agree. It's like, yeah, we've been trying to get more protein in this and that. It's like, okay, well, what's breakfast? What's lunch? What's dinner? What do we have for snacks? And it's like, this is like 1,800 calories. Like this is barely keeping you alive. And now we're underfed. And I want to point this out for everyone is like, okay, we're in this fate where we're barely eating enough just to stay alive and think. Now we're going to practice. We're beating ourselves down. That tissue gets stressed. It needs fuel to recover, but we're not giving it enough and we're just running on empty. And that's half of where we run into these stress fractures, overtraining, these sympathetic states where we can't recover and our brain just won't shut off. And it's like we're always in survival mode. And it's like, it's hard to get those calories, but definitely something as athletes and parents of these athletes, we want to make sure we're hitting and doing our due diligence there.
It's something just to end on this note, it's something fascinating because I actually spent a lot of time from the concept of like coaching dynamics and how that leads to stress and allostatic overload. Like I was fascinated by like how gym environments stress or don't stress athletes, and maybe that changes their long-term path. I considered doing a PhD in stress neuroendocrinology to study all this stuff. And like some of the work from like Robert Sapolsky and like Bruce McKeown and stuff on like what happens when you're chronically in a sympathetic state. It's crazy, right? Because like you're constantly in low level stress and you don't shift parasympathetic. So you don't have any like, it's challenging to digest food when you're in a constantly sympathetic ramped up state. And there's really no like shift into like tissue remodeling and tissue repair. And, you know, a lot of those things that you would think are, even if someone's doing a great job of planning their training well, if they're not eating well and then intentionally taking time to chill and relax and like shift into like not stressed out school gymnastics mode, it's really hard to get a parasympathetic tissue adaptation response. And then it's just, I just find that whole part fascinating because like I talk to a lot of college athletes, I consult a lot of like college gymnasts, and it's like, I don't think you realize that like you're doing all the hard work, but that's not how adaptation occurs. It's not like work plus work plus work equals adaptation. It's work. The optimal dosage of work plus the optimal dosage of rest is how you get true adaptation. So it's like sometimes 30 minutes of Netflix after a grinding day all day long is like actually helpful to put you in a chill state before you go to bed, or like taking a hot shower and just not thinking about the world for 15 minutes is really good for you. You know what I mean? Like it's hard to convince gymnasts who are so type A, go, go, go. And they've been just like, you know, just completely brainwashed to think that more is better all the time. It's really hard to teach them the opposite is true, which is the most elite pro athletes we work with are just as good at their recovery tools and shifting out of their training mode as they are hustling and killing it in the gym when they're there.
That's probably the hardest part for the younger high school age. It was like, okay, you're training Monday through Friday. Now you should like, we understand you want to go hang out with your friends. And we have, this is like, oh, I went to an amusement park all day or this and that. And I was traveling all weekend. It's like, that's good. And we want that. And it's like, also like, where are we just getting time to relax? And it's, you don't want to tell a kid they can't hang out with their friends either, because that's a huge part of development.
Totally.
But it's another lack of recovery there, another piece. But I digress from that. I think we get the gist there. And just for those listening that don't know about sympathetic and parasympathetic, as we're talking about, sympathetic drive is your state of basically fight or flight. So that the body is up, it's alert, it's doing what it can to keep you out of danger, keep you present. Where parasympathetic, as we talked, is more of your relaxation, rest and digest, kind of come down. It's where it's a state you would fall asleep in and be in a state where you're not stressed. But we sometimes see these athletes don't get out of that sympathetic state.
Right.
So as far as that goes, so that's all good. Strength and conditioning wise and injury prevention, how many times a week should someone be doing a legitimate strength and conditioning type program for gymnastics? And what should that include?
Yeah, this is something we've seen change dramatically in the last, 5 years, especially. I think Champion has been fortunately like kind of pioneering this hybrid model approach. And what we found successful is, I think starting at the age of 10, you can start slowly introducing hinge, pushing, pulling, all that kind of stuff, probably more in just a general setting, like in their gymnastics training during their strength. By the age of 12, we generally recommend people start, not because it's going to stunt their growth or anything that you would think, danger wise, that all that stuff is not true. It's more that it's just like mentally to focus on what you're doing and kind of have your brain attention for an hour to lift and stuff like that is challenging for someone who's 10. So we generally start people at 12 years old, and usually it starts with 1 day per week. And it's just a very basic program that fills in the gaps of what they're not getting in their gymnastics practice, right? So we definitely see a lot of gymnasts are not proficient with hinging and direct glute training, or upper back and scapular training, or direct hypertrophy of cuff work and hip work and accessory work for their calves. So we don't see any of that really inside of a gymnastics program. And if they're doing it, it's typically very low to no weight with body weight and very high repetition. So, and the opposite is true, which is that gymnastics forces are just astronomical. So we want to have some exposure to moderate load at moderate volume, because that's going to help us get more of like a you could argue two things, which is like there's like the mechanos-transductive, argument of like cartilage repair and tendinous stuff and tensegrity model, stuff like that. You could argue that like Wolff's Law, but you could also just argue that it's like a different stimulus on large type 2 muscle fibers, which would help out with power development. So I think both those things are true. So usually around 12, we'll start somebody with 1 day per week, filling in the gaps, not a crazy amount of volume, not a crazy amount of intensity, but just being proficient in basic patterns. So single leg weighted hip lift with some kettlebells or chains, maybe a goblet squat, maybe a feet elevated row or a face pull, maybe some sort of accessory cuff work. It's very, very basic, some sprinting, some general plyometrics, some learning how to actually run properly. Duesh and Jonah are just masters of just a basic program. So we'll do that in the off season in the summer, hopefully for 8 to 12 weeks. And then in the preseason, it shifts more towards like power work and jumping and med ball slams and ropes and stuff to get their explosive rate of force development stuff ready for the summer. And then they transition into season where it's kind of maintenance care mode. And then they, see me for arm care and some like proactive stuff, where they come in once a week as maintenance care. It's pretty good. And then when they get to like 14, we try to encourage them to do a full 2 day per week summer program, right? So like in the summer, it's 2 full split days, squat on 1 day, hinge on 1 day, split pelvis on 1 day, single leg the other day, all the anti-core stuff, all the direct face pulling and some like single arm pressing. And that starts to become more of like, let's give you what you're not getting, which is load. You're not getting external weight training to get the cartilage effect, get the training effect, get the large motor units going. Then we start introducing some like sprinting and plyo, change of direction to make you a general athlete. 2 days per week in the summer. Preseason, same thing. It maybe shifts to 1, or it's just all power focused, explosive rate of force development stuff. Most of the college athletes are doing this with their club, with their NCAA teams when they're at the facility. But the club girls will come in and still do 1 and 2 days per week. The guys will come in and do 1 day per week, and just all based on sports performance, right? Like that's still the biggest hurdle that we're translating, and it's explaining to people and breaking down why weight training doesn't equal bodybuilding, and why sports performance for a baseball player is an opposite field of sports performance for a gymnastics athlete. So we're trying to paint the picture for people of like what that looks like. And like, that's generally, as of now, that seems to be a really successful model for those that are willing to do it.
Interesting. And I think something you could do there too to paint that picture is just show them a weightlifter and all the shapes and sizes we come in. And that, like, I do competitions and some guys are like, you don't even look like you've lifted a weight. And they go out on the competition platform, like, holy crap, like that guy is in shape.
Yeah.
So just because we're doing these things doesn't mean we're going to turn into a TikTok bodybuilder influencer overnight. And so what would you say is, you said moderate volume, moderate intensity. What is something like that? So if we're going to do, a trap bar deadlift, what's that look like as far as reps, sets, and intensity?
Yeah. For newbies, right? For newbies, it's literally the most boring classic 3x10, because we're trying to get movement quality pattern to be high. And we want them to understand how to use the right thing for a hinge and not just like squat their deadlifts or, spine their deadlifts. So a lot of that stuff early on is just basic 3x10s with moderate volume, 7 to 10 at a RPE, nothing that would kill you, but nothing that would, make you feel like it's not worth your time. And we're trying to get to the point where we educate people early on that like, this isn't the most volume or most intensity, but like, this is very new for you. So the stimulus is going to be extremely new and your body's going to be sore. You're going to be sore. So we generally start people with just, basic 3x10s, 4x5s, nothing too crazy. And those 4x5s to 3x10s in that range are not in a rep range or a set and intensity that would be like a true hypertrophy or power block. You know what I mean? It's just like, it's literally like movement quality at the highest level. And if we get somebody for multiple summers in a row, like if we get them the second, third summer, then we start playing around with like actual volume responses, right? So then most of the stuff we do, I would say, is probably falls like for bilateral hinge or squat patterns, is kind of in like 3x8, because we don't think somebody has the proficiency to get into a 12 plus rep range where they're getting true hypertrophy and they can handle that quality. But then again, we don't want to put somebody on the other side, which is like a 3x3, right? Or like something that's just like, you need stupid amount of weight to get somebody a really high intensity. And you have to know how to create intent. You have to know how to brace. You have to know how to have really like a grind factor to those things. So usually somewhere in our like 8 to 10 is where most people fall. And then depending on the exercise, right? Like a 3x12 of a goblet squat is not crazy, but a 3x12 of a rear foot elevated split squat, I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy, right? It's just like horrifically hard. So we scale a lot with that. And then we do a lot of extra stuff too, like sleds and loaded carries and bear crawls and like a lot of just like the grunt work mentality. Like we like that for a lot of gymnasts because it just serves so many benefits versus like, you can get some stuff out of a landmine press for sure. But when you only have 1 day or 2 days and they're already skeptical, you don't want to load the cannon too hard.
For sure. And what about weightlifting type movements for gymnasts? I find it's interesting because as a weightlifting coach or Olympic weightlifting, uh, a lot of the best athletes in this sport have been former high level gymnasts.
Yeah.
And so, is there a translation there where, some of these movements, like girls are getting hurt on bars, doing a lot of bars? Um, is things like overhead pressing and power development with like power jerks or anything something you'd ever do with a gymnast just to give them like the opposite stimulus of what they've been accustomed
Mhm.
to?
Yeah. To the first point of that is that a lot of gymnasts make good weightlifters because they're extremely mobile and they know how to move their body very well. So that's a big part of it too. And I actually am friends with like a ton of Olympic weightlifters and or gymnasts who are Olympic, like Vanessa McCoy was a super high level gymnast. And now she's like a pretty high level weightlifter as well. Nelson now, because she got married. But I think the concepts of rate of force development and power derivatives are really, really helpful. The problem there is that when we're already barely getting someone in once per week or twice, if they're really trained, technically it's a lot to technically train them how to properly hang clean to get them, doing it to a point where it's worth your time. So for the majority of people, we won't use true barbell Olympic lifting work, but we will do Olympic lifting derivatives, right? So like landmine push jerks or dumbbell snatches, or we'll do that and combine it with like a seated dumbbell jump or a band resisted broad jump to try to get the similar stuff. Because for someone who's new to the barbell and you only get them once per week, to get them to maximally express like violent level of power on a hang clean is really tough, right? But I could definitely get there with a med ball slam, a seated box jump. I could definitely get there with maximal intent. After a week or two and you train someone to like really put maximal intent, I just think it just comes down to an equation of time. Like how much time do you have to really get someone's adaptation that you want? So we use a lot of Olympic lifting derivatives for landmines and or dumbbell work or med ball work. We'll do like that. And then some of like seated jumps and stuff like that. If someone's been with us multiple years, like we have one girl, Kylie, who's like the poster child of, doing well with gymnastics and weightlifting. She's been with us for like 5 years lifting. She could definitely learn some stuff like that. If Duesh wanted to teach her and he found it was relevant, or if like we thought that she could use that for her program, she would be fine. But then it comes into a situation of like, they often have very stiff wrists and very stiff lats from gymnastics. So getting in a front rack is kind of tough. It starts to be a little bit washy. So yes, it happens, but we believe you have to kind of earn the right to do those things.
Yeah, for sure. And no, I had two girls before that were like shoulder instability type things, and they were completely out of gymnastics because of it, and they were having troubles getting into a handstand and things like this
Yeah.
where they couldn't
Like a
get.
dumbbell push press would be amazing for that, or a dumbbell snatch a push jerk would be phenomenal for that.
Yeah, that's what we were doing, and then we even went back to a bar for a little because she wasn't doing gymnastics. I had her 3 times a week. We had the
Totally.
time to do it.
Totally. Yeah.
So, that was a big part of it, and it seemed to help her get better and get the confidence back to bear weight overhead.
Yeah.
And so, the other piece I wanted to bring up here before we end our show is mobility and stability. So every gymnast needs flexibility for sure. Most of them are pretty mobile anyways, whether it be genetically, they've already trained it, but it's the thing they always want to keep going back to. I need to stretch, I need to stretch, I need to stretch.
Yeah.
When a lot of them are lacking some significant joint stability too in their hips, their shoulders,
Right.
even thoracic spine. So what do you have to say about that? Of should every gymnast be stretching regardless of findings in
Yeah.
like a physical therapy screen, or what are your thoughts
Yeah.
there?
I think the background here is something that I was really fortunate for Mike to teach me, like from the baseball world, is like you can have athletes who are loose and tight at the same time. So a lot of baseball players, dancers, gymnasts, circus performers, whatever, they're loose jointed, but they can develop soft tissue adaptations that make them stiff still. So the more you repetitively throw a baseball, we know your shoulder gets stiff, you lose IR from a soft tissue point of view. And if you don't manage that and you lose elevation, you have elbow risk, right? You have a TJ layback risk from that stretch. So I think that's what we've seen come to fruition with gymnastics too, which is like you can have laxity in your joint capsules of your shoulder and your hip, but because the sport is so demanding on your adductors, your quads, your lats, your teres, you can start to get this little perfect storm where you're stiff and loose at the same time. So I think that's the first point of education for a lot of people is trying to bias soft tissue work and or stretching that is put towards the muscular tissue, not the joint capsules, right? So education on that comes down to like, I do think gymnasts do need to stretch every day because it's part of their warm up. It's part of their extreme flexibility maintenance, but how they go about that is very important, which is not just putting your leg up on a block and doing oversplits as your only, mechanism that you use. there's definitely a time and a place for over splits to get your full range of motion, but proper screening to know, is it your lat versus your teres major versus your pec? Like which one of those three things is the most involved? Soft tissue care via foam rolling, manual therapy, soft tissue dry needling, whatever, like that's probably good to add in there. But like specific stretching that is very targeted at the musculature. So on a lat, for example, is like a reverse PVC stick lat stretch is very different than someone just cranking your arms overhead because of the way ER versus IR works and adduction and what's causing cuff impingement versus what's actually stretching your lat, like that education. And then we do a ton of loaded eccentrics, like a lot of loaded eccentrics with chin up lowers or rear foot elevated split squats or RDLs. Like we try to do a lot of tempo pause eccentric work because we think there's some good research there on either desensitization of nociceptors or, sarcomerogenesis if you're getting spicy, like all that kind of stuff plays a role. And then active flexibility is probably the last thing. So we'd rather educate somebody on, okay, what does stretching do? It's probably desensitizing, nociceptors over time. What does stretching and soft tissue work do? What do eccentrics do? What does active flexibility do from the research point of view? Let's combine that into a good little circuit and give you that. And then you can also work on your active flexibility and your oversplits and stuff. But we have to really understand that these are patterns. Splits are patterns. Handstands are patterns in the same way that squatting is a pattern. You could have 6 people squat in front of you. One has stiff hips, one has stiff ankles, one has no core control. There's a lot of reasons why those squats can all look the same. And you have to have a toolkit to reverse engineer from a screening point of view what it is, and then kind of just focus on that. And then from there, it goes on to like maintenance care mode of like in season, what are you doing to manage your soft tissue and flexibility and all that kind of stuff. But I think they should be stretching every day, but it needs a much more critical lens about why we're stretching, what we're stretching, and kind of what's going on. Because if not, we get into, a lot of joint stress, some labral irritations. I'm filming a podcast today on like this for the hip, which is like all the things in a hip that unfortunately don't go well when you use improper flexibility methods and ankle weights and all sorts of crazy stuff.
Interesting. That was a lot of information right there. I have some homework to do now.
Yeah, it's all good.
And so eccentrics, you said you'll use. So is this just like from a strengthening standpoint, like mid neutral range? Like you're not going, are you going to extreme end ranges with those eccentrics, or you're just getting that muscle to figure out that it is stable, and from there the muscle tone comes down because it's not just trying to create stiffness to protect the joint?
Yeah, right. So there's a couple papers from BJSM and others that have shown that like loaded eccentrics, and these are like pretty heavy load, do have maybe a tissue level effect that we don't think we get with stretching and soft tissue work, which again is more neurological. Probably you could argue that some of the passive torque curves and yields modulus will change with consistent stretching, but I don't think that's the main reason people get more range of motion. But eccentrics, we think, is like a whole fucking but there's a whole rabbit hole here. There's a whole rabbit hole here around like what the mechanism is. Like nobody knows, right? Like let's just be frank about that. There's some in vivo studies that there is some epigenetic transfer of stretching, which causes some change in some sort of genetic marker, which puts more collagen out, baby. There's maybe some arguments that it's sarcomerogenesis, that it is causing that to happen. Sure, maybe that happens. There's some thought process that there's like titin molecules, submolecular, that stretch out, and that's causing some, who knows, right? Nobody knows. But we think that there's some sort of actual tissue level effect to the increase in length over time if we do consistent eccentric work. So what we're typically doing, again, is trying to coach somebody up on loading the musculature, like not so much the joint capsule. So if someone has extremely stiff hamstrings and we know it's not a neural issue, we'll give them in their warm-up 2 sets of 5 of a single leg kickstand RDL, a stiff-legged RDL with a 5-second lower and a 5-second hold when they feel like maximal intensity of stretch in their hamstrings. Then we'll put their other leg down and stand up on 2 legs, right? Same thing for a split squat. Well, somebody's got real stiff, quads and hip flexors. We could do a really posteriorly pelvically tilted rear foot elevated split squat lower for 5 seconds, hold the bottom for 5 seconds. I feel like my quad's going to tear. Put your other foot down, stand back up. So that's like loaded mobility work. Same thing with lats and like a dumbbell between your feet and a chin up lower on a low barbell. We'll add those in warm-ups to try to, get at, they do their soft tissue work, they do manual therapy, needling, then they go do some active mobility work. Maybe they go do some like specific drills for whatever their workout is for the day, whether it's a hinging pattern or something like that. Like we think that probably makes things stick a little bit longer because maybe we're capturing the best of the neurological bucket and tying that up with some of the actual connective tissue changes. And over time, if we program right, hopefully that will give some long, and we've seen some really good changes. If someone consistently does it 5 to 6 days per week for a month, we see some legit changes if they're not boning or osseous limitations.
So just a question out there for all the pain science gurus that say stretching doesn't work. Does stretching work?
I find it does. And if you look at like the review from like Thomas et al., for example, like 2018, they compared like all the studies of a meta-analysis of like static versus dynamic versus, plyometric or bounce stretching and dynamic stuff is like there is evidence that it works. Static stretching does increase range of motion if you do it 5 to 6 days per week consistently for 4 to 6 weeks. So like there's decent evidence that it does work to improve range of motion. I think the semantics here and the context, which is why I don't spend time arguing on social media, I'd rather talk to somebody like this about it, is it's context specific, and the methodology of the studies you have to look into. So like, does static stretching reduce nociceptive tolerance over time? I think we have decent evidence for that, right? I could definitely find you a paper that says that study's full of shit and the methodology is awful and nothing works and don't ever stretch ever. You can find studies that say nothing works ever. And I think that's a contrarian approach, and I'm all about critical analysis of evidence, but there's decent evidence that stretching does help increase range of motion if you do it consistently over time. And so like when a sport like gymnastics comes along and you need extreme range of motion for the demands of that sport, baseball, you need extreme layback for that sport. These athletes are asking for help to do a specific part of their sport. We should probably find some things that are supported in the evidence there. So I don't think stretching is going to reduce your risk of injury. I don't think stretching is going to make you miraculously faster. I don't think stretching is going to make you like, you know, the best athlete on planet Earth. But if your goal is to increase range of motion and you're going through puberty, I think there are some things that we can do to help out with that.
Awesome, man. Well, that was a ton, and we could do a whole nother episode on the training aspect of stretching and mobility and stability. But
we'll leave the fire there and just run away.
Yeah, no, it's just interesting because it's like, oh, stretching doesn't work, don't bother stretching. We saw studies. It's like, well, every good gymnast I know stretches, and they have to. So it's like stretching does something, and from the people that are doing it every day and getting anecdotal results, like there's something to it, even if we can't prove it in science. But
yeah,
there's people out there just spouting that it's a waste of time, and maybe for certain individuals it is. And I definitely don't have everyone stretch, but for gymnasts, I definitely think it's a crucial part of keeping them healthy to do their sport.
I would agree. When you watch someone do a switch leap or a Tkachev and you see how far their shoulders and hips go, it's probably a good idea to keep their soft tissue mobile.
Yeah, because I don't stretch and I'm not a gymnast. So, yeah. But I've done a lot of prolonged static stretching for periods of time, and it's always seemed to improve my mobility. It's just I don't stay with it. So,
sure,
story for another day. But anyways, Dave, thanks for coming on. This was great. I can't wait to share this with everyone because there's a lot of information I think people out there need to hear, whether it be gymnastics coaches, parents, gymnasts themselves. So, Dave, where can people find you?
Yeah, Shift Movement Science has everything. So Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, email, blog posts, podcast. We're all there.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on. And yeah, that's a wrap for today. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Brett. Appreciate it.
No problem.